welcome to our special show on the Great Climate Change Challenge. I'm Gargi Rawat. Today we're going to focus on the upcoming COP-28 or the 28th Conference of Parties, the UN Climate Change Conference. This will be taking place from the 30th of November to the 12th of December, where world leaders will discuss some of the most challenging and important questions regarding climate change and the future. This in a year that has seen a series of extreme climate activities, not only in India, but across the globe. COP28 will be the first global stocktake of the Paris Agreement. Now, at the Paris Agreement of 2015, it was decided by 196 parties that they will hold the increase of global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. It was a landmark decision at the time that created a framework that works on a 5-year cycle. So this year's COP28 is about global stocktake, which is taking stock or evaluating what different nations have done to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and enable sustainable lifestyles. The Global Stocktake report was also released by the UNFCCC earlier this year. So what are the key findings of the report? Where do nations stand? Can we achieve these goals? What are the different problems? And could be the solution? That's what we're going to discuss in today's episode. To talk about these issues, today we're joined by Vivek Kumar Devangan, Chairman and Managing Director, REC Limited. Thank you for joining us again on the show. Harjeet Singh, who's the head Global Political Strategy, Climate Action Network International. Aarti Khosla, Founder Director, Climate Trends. And Bharat Pandey, who's joining us, a Sustainability and Social Impact Partner at BCG. Thank you so much all for joining us. And we have an audience of young people as well who I hope have some, keen questions to ask all our panelists. But Mr. Singh, I'd like to start with you going into COP28. What do you see as the key challenges? Where are we today in the world when it comes to the issue of climate change?
It's very clear that we are nowhere near in our target in terms of reducing emissions or staying below 1.5 degree target. We are already at 1.2 degree temperature rise compared to pre-industrial era. In fact, we have temporarily crossed 2 degrees Celsius threshold. And the kind of disasters that we are seeing...
And that happened just recently.
Recently. And the kind of disasters we are seeing all around the world, it's all because of the rise in temperature. The kind of erratic weather patterns that we are seeing, glaciers are melting, sea levels are rising, and it is catastrophic for communities already. And if we continue to increase our emissions and temperatures continue to rise, it means it's going to be far more devastating than what we have seen. And as we go to the COP, it's extremely important for us to look at all three pillars of climate action, as we call them. But there are people who are already facing these devastation. They're losing their homes, farms, and income. They need support, and that's what we call addressing loss and damage. So this COP28 is going to be extremely important because it's going to look at all three aspects and the factors that are going to help us achieve these targets in terms of reducing emissions and helping people to adapt. Which means means of implementation, as we call them in technical terms, that is finance and technology to be provided. So this COP is going to be quite complex because there are many big agendas on the table.
Aarti, if you can talk a bit about that, these negotiations get so dense, the issues are so many, and, we're running out of time. In fact, many would say we've already run out of time. So what do you see as the main challenges when we go into these climate negotiations?
The 2-year-long process, which has been known as the Global Stocktake, that's the one which will be negotiated here, and countries will come and decide how much action each one needs to take. We also saw at the G20 for the first time the tripling of renewables was agreed as a target. That is one of the pledges which might come out at the COP even. But the reality is that unless you don't match the tripling of climate ambition with also the tripling of finance, it is a fairly pointless ask. And I think those are the technical issues which will be discussed, that while the global stocktake shows so much gap in terms of where we must be, what is the gap on finance and how that gap must be bridged? I think the two principles here which are important, no matter how much you talk about everybody should take action, is the principle of historical responsibility as well as the principles of equity. There needs to be a respect for historical responsibility where pollution happened before. How is it that you count for it in terms of action going forward? And that's where a lot of the contention comes in, because that is where the right to development really intersects with what climate action is going to be about, and those are the nitty-gritties that the global stocktake will discuss. This year has been smashed in terms of temperature rising, monsoons going awry, heat waves, deluge, so on and so forth. But at the same time, there is very less ability to even put a basic operationalization of something known as the loss and damage fund. So if there were that operationalization at this COP, I think it will be a huge symbolism both for the presidency, which is hosting the COP in fairly contentious situation, being a petro-state, but also having a very tough situation in its own neighborhood with respect to the Hamas and the Israel situation. And all of that is going to reflect on how much UAE is able to just have the muscle as well as the negotiating power to get some of the major emitting countries to agree to a minimum viable product, which is agreement on what the GST should come out with, where the solutions and opportunities lie, who should act first, and who should really act because it's domestic imperative to act.
Talking about the challenges the world is facing, and as you said, the situation in Gaza and Israel, etc. It's crazy to think that, all of you activists have been talking so much about all these issues, what needs to be done, and to think of the millions that are being spent on these two wars that are currently in Ukraine and Gaza, and whereas a lot of the funding issues is what are the sticking points when it comes to climate negotiations, and given what we're seeing. But Mr. Devangan, a little bit about India. We've made a lot of, ambitious pledges, zero emission by 2070. How are we going to achieve this? If you could tell us a bit about our strategies, as well as what are the big challenges?
India is one of the few G20 countries which has been able to meet its commitment made in COP-21 at Paris in 2015. We had committed that we'll bring down our emission intensity of GDP by 33 to 35% of 2005 level by the year 2030. We already achieved that by the year 2021. That's why we have enhanced our ambition to reduce the emission intensity of GDP by about 45% by the year 2030. India had committed in Paris that 40% of our installed electricity capacity will come from renewable energy by the year 2030. We have already achieved that by the year 2022. Now we have enhanced our ambition that 50% of our installed electricity capacity will come from non-fossil fuel sources by the year 2030. That is about 500 gigawatt capacity we are planning to install. We already achieved 179 gigawatt installed capacity we are having from non-fossil fuel sources. Another 321 gigawatt capacity would get installed in the next 7 years. That would entail a total investment of about 15 lakh to 20 lakh crore over the next 7 years for achieving the target that we have set for ourselves by the year 2030. And when we are targeting to become net zero by the year 2070, that will, 2-3 studies have been carried out, which will entail total investment of about 13 to 15 trillion dollar by the year 2070. I hope that this COP-28, which is being held in UAE in Dubai, will make government and private sector to come together to address climate change issue, and they have to address this climate financing issue. The low cost of financing is the issue which needs to be addressed.
Let's go across to Bharat Pandey now. And Bharat, a bit about the Paris Agreement and, the significance it had in shaping our journey in terms of the climate crisis and also the global stocktake. If you could, tell us a bit about the key challenges that will be ahead and the kind of negotiations we can expect.
Kudos to NDTV for this program. I think it's a super important topic and you've given it a lot of importance. Because there are a lot of young people in the room, just to say, why is this such a difficult problem to solve and negotiate, given all the data that the other panelists also mentioned, right? And it's just worth keeping in mind that climate change is the global public good, which means that it affects all of us in the world equally, because the global greenhouse gas emissions are in the atmosphere. So we all have to act. Now the problem is who should act and how much should they act is where it gets tricky. And so the UN FCCC process has got this great phrase called common but differentiated responsibilities. It's a masterful phrase, the great principle, and we can all agree on the common part. But I think on the differentiated responsibilities part is where we end up debating, which is who should do how much. And the traditional view has been, the global north, which is the developed countries, have really contributed to this problem most. And so A, they should act. And B, to the extent they want the global south or developing countries to act, They should give them finance and technology, what Harjeet called the means of implementation, to actually make things happen. So this is the challenge. And then, of course, the UN process is such that everyone has to agree on everything, and that's the way that you have an agreement. So generally, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And that's why it took till COP-21 to get to the Paris Accord. But obviously, it's, we feel that we could do much better. My favorite number is we need to have reduced emissions by 43% as a globe by 2030, and we are still growing. However, Gargi, I feel this is more a situation of, a glass half full than glass half empty. So I'm in the optimist camp, and I'll tell you why. I think the first thing is that I think everybody has woken up to the problem, right? 14, 15 years ago, when you and I used to discuss this topic, there were climate negotiators and then there were activists, right? And that was basically the two sets of people who used to be on the table. Today, everybody is on the table. So you'll see at COP-28 in Dubai, which is expecting 60,000 people to come. So everybody is on the table talking about this issue. The second is there's real pressure to act, which is much more than used to be 10 years ago. So you see any of the sentiment surveys on climate change, people, ordinary people, young people like you are speaking up and asking for action. The third is technology breakthroughs. So we are seeing massive reductions in cost curves. Solar and wind have already become cost competitive and all cheaper than fossil in most cases. And lastly, of course, the other panelists have mentioned the issue of finance. Long way to go. We need to spend $3 to $5 trillion a year on this problem. But at least the numbers are going up. So we are now talking of this being the first year where $1 trillion worth of climate investments would have gone in for the first time. There's a long-standing number also in the COP discussions, which that the developed countries should pay the developing countries $100 billion a year as climate finance. This has been on the table since 2009 Copenhagen, and this is the year we'll finally probably get to it. And we are also going to discuss at Dubai what will be the new climate finance goal. So all of these give me hope that, it is a situation, despite all the problems of it being a glass half full.
Right. Well, that's a very optimistic view, Varad. And yes, I suppose if you look at it from that point of view, how everybody is at the table now, though it should have happened a long time ago, and time many feel has already run out. But a nice take there. I'd like to get some of the young people in, if any of you have questions.
The emission rate of India is much lower than other developed countries, but still India is targeted. Why?
We need to look at where India is in terms of absolute emissions and also per capita. So you're absolutely right. When we look at per capita emissions, we are way, way below the world average. But when it comes to aggregate emissions, that's where we are at number 3. Number 1 is China, then the US, and if you only look at countries, then India. And this is why India is targeted. But if you look at and if you compare emissions between India and China, it's 1/5. Both in terms of aggregate emissions and even per capita, it's way, way less. Yes, the current proportion of emissions we have is about 7%. So because of that ranking, India is targeted, and it is an unfair thing that India has been facing for a very long time, because the world community is ignoring the developmental challenges that India has in terms of number of people who are still living in poverty, as well as not sufficient access to energy.
Right. Well, thank you for that, and thank you for the question. We're going to slip into a short break, and we'll come back to more on this issue of India in terms of these climate change negotiations. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Great Climate Change Challenge, and we're talking about COP-28 and what's expected as the world leaders are going to meet later this month in the UAE, and also India's role in these negotiations. Atik Khosla, we're just talking about India's role and India's challenges in terms of commitments on climate change, but our challenges in terms of sustainable development as well as development for such a huge population.
If you look at just the last 2 decades, our electricity demand itself increased 3 times, And going forward, as India will assume a bigger status and the rising middle class will need more demand of electricity and other resources, this power demand is going to increase as well. And there is also the demand for energy which will come from the transport sector, from the industrial sector. And there is a lot of thrust that the government is giving, as you can see, to electrify. If you see data, last year, no project finance came into thermal power assets. All the project finance moved to renewable-based sources, and more than 80% of new installed was solar power. So you believe it or not, but solar is really becoming the queen of the power sector in the country, and India is becoming at the helm of the international energy affairs for that reason.
You know, if we look back at the Paris Agreement and the commitments made then, and within a few years, there'd been so much advancement when it comes to renewables, to solar, to wind energy. And Mr. Devangan, India at this point, that's what we need, technology, and for that we need the funding. So how do you see this going forward?
Renewable energy is intermittent in nature. So we don't have solar energy is available only during daytime, and wind comes in the morning and evening time. In order to have stable grid, we need to have storage solution. A lot of technological advancement is required to bring down the cost of storage. Without storage, we will not be able to balance the grid. A lot of work has to be done for technological solution with regard to storage. Similarly, new technology area like...
That's why we need to push at these climate negotiations to get that funding for technology, exactly. More partnerships in terms of, advancement and doing this research.
Exactly. Like there are new niche areas also, green hydrogen, green ammonia. There are also the cost of generation of hydrogen. Green hydrogen is quite high at this stage. It is cost about $6 per kg of hydrogen. Until unless we bring down the cost of production of green hydrogen to about $1 per kg, we will not be able to scale up this. So these are the technological challenges. For that we need to have climate finance. That too, low-cost financing is required.
It's interesting to see how, India, China and all that, how it's going to play out at the upcoming negotiations. But more questions from our audience. Yes, go ahead.
What are the potential challenges and obstacles to reaching a successful outcome at the COP-28 conference?
Well, let's take that across to Bharat, I guess. Bharat, would you like to take that question?
I think, as you said, Gargi, the challenges are, long-standing, but maybe just worth noting what are the 3 or 4 biggest priorities that the COP28 presidency of the UAE has highlighted, because that will give you a clue on, where we might land. So one, of course, as you mentioned, the global stocktake, and Aarti talked about it in detail, so I won't. But basically, I think the line I like to think, it is telling us already that we are way off target, but can we, take it from not just being a catalogue of our failures to being a springboard for action, if one was to put it poetically. But in addition, the 4 things that the presidency is focusing. One is energy transition. The second is, what they are calling a new deal on finance, which is how do we get these numbers to go up substantially on climate finance, whether it's the $100 billion concessional number from the global north to the south, whether it's new innovative mechanisms of finance. So that's the second, deal on finance. The third, very interestingly, is this topic of nature, lives and livelihood. So it's very interesting that the climate discussion today is getting merged with the discussion on nature, biodiversity, water, and even health this time is a very big topic, because the intersection of climate with these topics is becoming very, very clear. And lastly, their focus is on what they call an inclusive COP, which is really making sure that the youth, the indigenous communities, businesses, technologies and startups, all of them have a major role to play at the COP. So that really is the agenda where the COP presidency is keen to focus on. We are hopeful all of those pillars, there can be significant movement.
All right. One more question. Yes, the young man there.
My question is about nuclear energy. And is nuclear energy an alternative viable to fossil fuels? And there's a lot of debate whether nuclear energy is safe or not, and I want to hear the opinion of the
that's a very interesting question. Who would like to take that? Would like to take it? Yes.
There is a lot of resurgence that we are seeing, and even politics-wise, there are countries like US, Japan, possibly even South Korea, and there is a case that is being made for small and medium-sized nuclear reactors, and to put those nuclear reactors, because the longer ones take a very long time to set up. But the real fear with nuclear is how to dispose the waste. And even if there is a slightest and minuscule chance that the waste might leak, is that the risk to take, especially at the day and age when you have renewable sources like solar and wind which are deflationary, which are clean? Is there a case to be made for nuclear? And I think that's the predicament that the world is split between. That is perhaps also the predicament that the world is, that India is at the moment. And if you see the latest Central Electricity Authority report, that makes a very good case which says India does not need so much nuclear or gas, and all the additional demand can be met by pure renewables.
I think it's also important to recognize that even now the proportion of nuclear in our overall energy mix is barely 2%. And government is not planning to increase that. The reason government relies on nuclear is quite similar to coal in terms of providing a base load, because renewable energy remains intermittent. But at the same time, as Aarti said, we need to weigh the options, and clearly nuclear energy has a lot more risks. And right now, the way renewable energy has become so feasible and easily available, yes, it's not completely free from all the vices because mining is involved there, but still the world is going for renewable energy, and that's the direction to take.
Absolutely. So, Mr. Devangan, final word. We're running out of time, but basically India's focus is on, technology, green technology, and getting funding for that going into COP28.
So India is collaborating with different agencies across the world for developing this cost-effective technology. Like I had told you about the storage solution, green hydrogen, green ammonia. These are the way forward. The main challenge is to get climate finance at reasonable cost. So right now, there is no dearth of the fund for climate financing. The question is how to bring down the cost of financing. And on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, each country has to develop its own action plan to achieve these energy transition targets.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Bharat, also for joining us, and the audience as well. So as you can see, many challenges ahead, but we can be ever hopeful and, like Bharat, see the glass half full. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.